My name is Claire. At my grandfather's funeral reception, my brother stood up in front of 50 relatives and announced that I didn't deserve a single thing from the estate because I had no husband and no children to carry the family name forward. My sister-in-law started clapping, slowly, deliberately, like she was applauding a verdict she'd been waiting years to deliver. And my mother? She nodded, just nodded, like it was the most reasonable thing anyone had ever said out loud, in a room full of people who were supposed to love me. They said it like it was fact, like my worth had an expiration date that ran out the moment I turned 32 without a ring on my finger. But that wasn't the part that broke something inside me. The part that broke something was realizing they had planned it. This wasn't grief talking. This wasn't a slip. This was a performance, and I had been invited to my own humiliation without knowing the show was already written. So I made one quiet move, just one, and everything they thought they had secured started to come apart at the seams. The call came on a Wednesday evening. I had just gotten home from a 12-hour shift at the hospital where I worked as a physical therapist, and I was still in my scrubs, standing at the kitchen counter eating leftover soup straight from the pot, when my phone lit up with my mother's name. She didn't say hello. She said, "We're burying your grandfather Saturday. The reception will be at your brother's house afterward. I need you to wear something appropriate. Something appropriate. Not I love you. Not I know this is hard. Not even a basic acknowledgement that I had also lost someone." I told her I'd be there. I spent the next 2 days quietly grieving the man who had taught me how to ride a bike in an empty parking lot behind his hardware store, who had slipped me $20 bills folded into tiny squares every Christmas until I was old enough to feel embarrassed about it, who used to call me his steady one because I never lost my head in a crisis. I cried alone in my apartment in Portland, packed a bag, and drove the 4 hours to my hometown in eastern Oregon with a casserole dish balanced in the back seat and a card I had written by hand because I thought it might mean something at the reception. My grandfather's funeral was held at the small Presbyterian church he'd attended for 40 years. The service was quiet and honest, which is what he would have wanted. Afterward, we drove in a procession to the cemetery, and I stood at the edge of the crowd in my dark coat while the pastor spoke, watching my brother across the grave. He was holding his wife's hand and had his chin lifted slightly, the way he always did when he felt like he was in charge of something. My brother is 2 years older than me. He married his wife when he was 26, and they have 3 kids, which in our family's accounting system apparently gives him a kind of moral authority that I have never been able to earn. He took over my grandfather's hardware store when my grandfather's knees made it impossible for him to stand behind the counter all day. It was supposed to be temporary. That was 7 years ago. He never left, and somehow that fact quietly transformed him, in the family's eyes, into the keeper of the legacy. Everything I did finishing my degree, building a career, buying my own apartment with no help from anyone, was somehow filed under individual achievement rather than contribution to the family, as if the only contribution that counted was the one that kept you tethered to the same zip code. The reception at my brother's house was already crowded by the time I arrived. I had stopped at my mother's to pick her up, which made me 10 minutes late, and by the time we walked through the front door, the living room was filled with uncles and cousins and church friends balancing small plates of food and speaking in the hushed tones that people use when they're not quite sure what they're allowed to feel yet. I set my casserole on the kitchen counter, found a corner near the bookshelf where I could see the room without being in the center of it, and spent the first hour listening. My sister-in-law circulated through the guests with the ease of someone who had hosted 100 of these events, touching shoulders, refilling glasses, laughing quietly at the right moments. She was good at this. I had to give her that. Nobody asked me how I was doing. My uncle shook my hand when he passed by. A cousin waved from across the room. My mother sat in the armchair nearest the window and received condolences like a small, dignified queen. She glanced at me once and gave a slight tilt of her head that meant, "You're fine over there. Don't make yourself a burden." I had been making myself not a burden for 32 years. I was very good at it. The afternoon moved slowly. The food was good. People began to share stories about my grandfather. And for a while the room felt warm and real, like grief was something we were all holding together instead of separately. I found myself laughing at a story my uncle told about my grandfather driving the wrong way down a one-way street in 1987 and arguing with the officer that the sign was ambiguous. Then my brother tapped his glass. The room quieted the way rooms do when someone signals that something official is about to happen. He thanked everyone for coming. He talked about my grandfather's legacy, about the hardware store, about roots and responsibility, and what it meant to carry something forward. He was a decent speaker when he wanted to be. People nodded. Then he looked at me. "There's something our family needs to address," he said. "Something Grandpa's passing makes necessary to talk about now." I felt the shift before I understood it. The air changed. A few people glanced between him and me. My sister-in-law folded her hands in front of her and pressed her lips together in the particular way she did when she was very pleased with herself. "The lakehouse," my brother said, "has always been a family property. Everyone here knows that. Grandpa wanted it to stay in the family, to be used by family, to benefit the next generation." He paused. "Claire has been the one with her name on the deed for the last 8 years. But Claire doesn't have a family of her own. No husband, no kids. So the question we need to ask is whether it makes sense for her to hold on to something that was always meant for the generations coming after us." The room was very quiet. "We think," he continued, and the "we" landed like a stone, "that the right thing would be for Claire to transfer the deed over to me and my wife. We have 3 children. We have roots here. We're the ones who are going to carry Grandpa's name forward." My sister-in-law started clapping. One pair of hands, slow and certain, like a period at the end of a sentence she had rehearsed. I looked at my mother. She nodded, eyes forward, expression settled. She had known. She had known before she called me. Before she told me to wear something appropriate. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it was not what people might expect. It was not rage, although rage was somewhere underneath it. What I felt first was a cold, clarifying kind of recognition. Because the lake house wasn't a family property in the way my brother was implying. My grandfather had signed that deed over to me specifically, 8 years ago, with a letter that I still had, in which he wrote that he trusted me to take care of it because I was the steady one. I had paid the property taxes every year. I had repaired the dock, after the storm, 3 years ago out of my own savings. I had driven up there 6 times a year to maintain it, clean it, make sure it wasn't falling apart. My brother had been there twice in 8 years. Both times for summer weekends, where he and his wife used my kayaks and left the kitchen dirty. None of that was in the room, though. What was in the room was 50 people who had just watched a grieving widow nod her approval while her son publicly declared that his sister's life choices disqualified her from owning what was legally, undeniably, hers. I set down my glass. "No," I said. Clearly, no apology in it. My brother blinked. My sister-in-law's hand stopped moving. "The lake house is mine," I said. "The deed is in my name. That's not a family tradition. That's property law. And this conversation is over." The silence was different from the silence that had come before. This one had texture. Then my mother spoke, loud enough for the room. "You always were selfish," she said. "You've been selfish your whole life. You think your grandfather would want you sitting alone in that house with no family? You think that's what he built it for?" I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the 8 years of property taxes. I thought about the dock. I thought about the letter in my filing cabinet that said, in my grandfather's handwriting, that he trusted me. "Yes," I said quietly. "I think that's exactly what he built it for." I didn't wait for the response. I walked to the kitchen, picked up the casserole dish I had driven 4 hours with, and walked out to my car. My hands didn't shake until I hit the highway. I didn't play music on the drive. I drove with the windows cracked slightly, and the heater on low, watching the highway cut through the high desert dark, and I let my brain do what it did well, which was organize. Not feel, not yet. Organize. By the time I was 90 miles from Portland, I had a list in my head. Step 1, pull the deed. Step 2, locate my grandfather's letter. Step 3, call an attorney first thing in the morning. Step 4, figure out exactly what my brother thought he had on me. I got home after midnight. My cat, a gray tabby named Juniper, was waiting on the windowsill and complained loudly when I came through the door. I sat on the kitchen floor with her in my lap for a few minutes, not doing anything, just sitting. Then I got up, opened my laptop, and started pulling files. My grandfather had been deliberate about things. He had a deliberate quality that I had always admired. He didn't say much, but what he said was usually exact. When he signed the lake house over to me, it had been a Saturday morning in October. I was 24, just out of school, and he had asked me to come to the hardware store when it was closed, so it would just be the 2 of us. He had the paperwork already prepared, notarized, ready to sign. He said, "You're the one I trust to keep this right. Your brother has enough to manage. Then he handed me the letter and told me to keep it somewhere safe. I had kept it in a fire-safe box under my bed. I pulled it out that night and read it twice. In the morning, I called an attorney named Diane, who had been recommended to me 2 years earlier by a colleague whose landlord had tried to unlawfully evict her. Diane was methodical and unimpressed by drama, which was exactly what I needed. I explained the situation. She asked 3 questions, all practical. Then she said, "Forward me the deed, the letter, and any records you have of the property maintenance expenses. We'll start there." I spent the next 3 hours compiling everything. 8 years of property tax receipts, bank records showing transfers for the dock repair, the new water heater I had installed 2 summers ago, the annual insurance payments. I had kept everything because I was the kind of person who kept everything. My grandfather had been the same way. What I found when I started going through the older files was something I hadn't been looking for. Tucked into a folder I hadn't opened in 2 years was a scanned copy of a document my brother had mailed me 4 years ago. He had framed it as a family agreement, a 1-page document suggesting that the lakehouse be registered as a shared family asset, with use rotating between family members annually, and that any future sale would require unanimous family consent. He had asked me to sign and return it. I had never signed it. I had forgotten it existed. But there was my brother's signature on the bottom, and on the line above it, a signature that was supposed to be mine. Someone had signed my name, and the document was dated 6 weeks ago. I stared at the screen for a very long time. Then I forwarded it to Diane with a note that said, "I never signed this. That is not my signature." She called me back within the hour. "Do you have anything with your actual signature from around that date that we can compare?" I did. "I had several," she said. "This changes things significantly. We're no longer talking only about a property dispute. I already knew that. I had worked in a hospital long enough to understand what it meant when something that looked like paperwork was actually something else." Over the next 2 days, I did not contact my brother. I did not contact my mother. I answered a text from my cousin who said she was sorry about how things had gone at the reception, and I replied with a brief thank you and left it there. I was not ready to be comforted. I was in a different gear entirely. Diane had connected me with a forensic document examiner who confirmed within 48 hours that the signature on the family agreement did not match my known signature samples. The letter formation, the pressure patterns, the specific way I wrote the C in my first name, all of it was inconsistent. Someone had made an effort, but not enough of one. On Thursday morning, I filed a police report for document fraud. On Thursday afternoon, I sent my brother an email with a subject line that said, "We need to talk about the document." He called within 20 minutes. His voice had that sharpened edge I remembered from childhood arguments, the tone he used when he felt like he was being accused of something he believed he was entitled to do. "You're making this into something it isn't," he said. "You forged my signature," I said. I was trying to get ahead of the legal complications. Grandpa didn't update his will clearly enough, and I was protecting the family. "The deed is in my name," I said. "The will is irrelevant to the deed. You know that. Whoever helped you with that document knows that. And now the police know about the document." There was a silence. "You called the police," he said. It wasn't a question. It had the sound of something recalibrating. "I did," I said. "And I'm giving you this one phone call to tell you that anything further, any attempt to contest the deed, any legal action, any more documents with my name on them, will be met with everything I have. I have the deed. I have Grandpa's letter. I have 8 years of maintenance records. And I now have a forensic analysis of your signature work. So I'd think carefully." He hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment, then set it on the counter. Juniper walked across the table and butted her head against my elbow. I scratched behind her ears. I had expected to feel something louder. Victory, maybe, or relief. What I felt was quieter than that. More like the feeling after a long hike when you finally sit down and realize you've been holding your breath the whole way up. My sister-in-law posted something on social media 2 days later. I didn't follow her, but a cousin screenshot it and sent it to me. It was a quote graphic with soft lighting that said, "Some people prioritize property over family. We choose legacy." She had captioned it with a prayer hands emoji and tagged my brother. I looked at it for exactly as long as it took me to screenshot it and add it to the folder I had labeled, with appropriate plainness, evidence. The following week, Diane called with news that had not been in my original plan but should not have surprised me. "The document your brother submitted to the county assessor's office," she said. The one with the forged signature, he used it to apply for a change in the property's tax designation. If it had gone through, it would have reclassified the lakehouse as a multi-owner family asset, which would have made any future sale or transfer subject to majority family vote. I took a breath. How far did it get? The assessor flagged it for verification before processing. Standard protocol. They reached out to you. Did you receive anything? I thought back. There was a letter I thought was routine. I set it aside. That's what saved you, she said. The assessor's verification process stalled the application. We've now submitted the correction with your actual documentation. The application has been withdrawn, and the assessor's office has flagged the account for any future submissions. I exhaled slowly. What about the fraud filing? It's been received and assigned. Whether it goes further depends on how the investigation develops. But it's on record. That matters. It did matter. Not because I needed my brother to face criminal consequences, though a part of me felt that he deserved to. It mattered because a record is a fact, and facts are harder to revise than family stories. My mother called me that Friday evening. I let it go to voicemail. In the message she left, she did not apologize. She said she thought I was taking this too far, and that my grandfather would not have wanted the family torn apart over a piece of property. Her voice was steady and slightly aggrieved, the tone of someone who believes they are being unjustly inconvenienced. I saved the voicemail and did not call back. What I did instead was drive up to the lake house that weekend. I hadn't been since before my grandfather died, and I needed to be there, not for anything practical, just to be in the place that he had given me because he trusted me to keep it right. The drive up took 2 hours. The last 20 minutes were on a winding road through pine trees that opened suddenly into a view of the lake, slate gray in the October light, ringed by hills that still had a few last colors left in them. I parked in the gravel pull-off and sat in the car for a moment before getting out. The dock was solid. I had paid to have it repaired, and the contractor had done good work. I walked to the end of it and stood there in the cold air, with my hands in my coat pockets, looking out at the water. It was so quiet up here, the kind of quiet that doesn't demand anything from you. I thought about my grandfather standing on this same dock. He had fished here alone mostly. He was not a social fisherman. He liked the solitude of it, the patience. He told me once that the best thing about fishing was that you couldn't rush it, and the world had very few places left where you couldn't rush something. I understood, standing there, why he had chosen me. I stayed 2 nights. I brought groceries, cooked simple meals, read a book I had been meaning to finish for months. On the second morning, I woke up early and walked the perimeter of the property in the mist, noting what needed attention, making a mental list, because that is what I do with things I care for. The dock was solid. The roof looked fine. There was a section of fence near the road that needed a new post. When I drove back to Portland on Sunday evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Settled. The legal process unfolded over the following months with the methodical slowness of official things. The forged document remained under investigation. Diane successfully registered an updated protective notation on the deed, making any future transfer attempts subject to additional verification steps. My brother made no further legal moves. Whether that was because of the fraud filing or because his own attorney had advised against it, I didn't know and didn't ask. My mother and I did not speak for 11 weeks. When she finally called again, in January, she did not mention the lake house directly. She talked about the weather and asked if I was eating enough, the way she did when she was trying to pretend a wound had already healed. I answered her questions and kept the call short. I was not cruel. I was also not willing to pretend. There was a woman at my hospital named Rosa, who was 58 years old and had been quietly managing the rehabilitation ward for longer than anyone could remember. She had raised 2 kids alone, put them both through college, and was the kind of person who noticed when someone else was struggling before they admitted it to themselves. She stopped me one afternoon in the break room, poured me a cup of coffee, and said, "You look like someone who's been carrying something for a long time and recently set it down. How are you?" I was so surprised by the accuracy of that description that I laughed. Then I told her, briefly and without all of the details, what had happened. She nodded slowly when I finished. "The hardest thing," she said, "is when you realize the version of you they're angry at is the version that finally stops shrinking." I thought about that for a long time afterward. In March, I drove back up to the lake house for a weekend work trip. I fixed the fence post. I repainted the trim on the front porch, which had been chipping since before my grandfather's health began to decline. I replaced the outdoor light fixture over the door, which had been there so long it had oxidized to a greenish gray. On the last evening, I sat on the dock again, this time with a glass of wine and the journal I had started keeping after everything happened. I wrote things in it that I hadn't said to anyone, not because they were secrets, but because they needed time before they were ready to become words. I wrote about my grandfather, about the Saturday morning in October, and the way he had folded his hands on the counter and looked at me with that steady, particular attention he gave to things that mattered to him. About the letter, which I now kept not in the fire-safe box but in my desk drawer, somewhere I could reach it without going looking. I wrote, "He saw me, clearly and without conditions. That's what made it his to give." I wrote, "I spent a long time being the easiest one to overlook. I think I believe that made me good. It just made me invisible." I wrote, "The quiet move wasn't the phone call to Diane, though that was part of it. The quiet move was the moment I said no and didn't explain myself. I said no and I let it be no. That was the first time. The sun was going down over the ridge when I closed the journal. The water went from gray to silver to a deep, dark blue. The pine trees on the opposite shore disappeared into the dusk. I had done nothing dramatic. I had not exploded. I had not delivered a speech that left the room silent in awe. I had said no, walked out, called an attorney, filed a report, and let the facts speak in the language that facts actually speak: documents, records, verified signatures, official processes. They had expected me to either comply or collapse. They had never, in 32 years, seen me do neither. That was their miscalculation. By the time spring arrived, the investigation had been officially referred for prosecutorial review. I didn't know what would come of it, and I had made peace with not knowing. What I knew was what I could document, and what I could document was extensive. My brother sent me a text in April that said, "I think we both handled this wrong. I'd like to talk." I read it twice. I appreciated that he had moved, however slightly, from his original position. I also noticed that we both handled this wrong was doing a great deal of work in a very small number of words. I replied, "When you're ready to be specific about what you did and why, I'll be ready to listen." He didn't respond. That was fine. I wasn't waiting. Rosa retired from the hospital in May, and I went to her small farewell gathering in the break room. She hugged me when she was leaving and said, "Don't let them teach you that your life is the lesser one. It never was." I drove home with the windows down and the late afternoon light falling across the highway in long gold strips. I thought about what it meant to carry something forward. My brother had talked about legacy at the reception, about the name, about the generations coming after us. He thought legacy was something you claimed. My grandfather had known it was something you built quietly, over years, with steady hands and the willingness to show up even when no one was watching. I was his steady one. He had said so in his own handwriting, and no one's signature could change that. The lakehouse was still mine. The fence post was repaired. The dock was solid. The trim was freshly painted, and the light above the door was the kind of clean brass that catches the morning sun and throws it back warm and clear. I had earned my peace, not loudly, not all at once, one quiet, irreversible step at a time. And if you've ever been told by the people who should have protected you that your life is worth less because of the choices you made, or didn't make, I want you to hear this. The people who measure your worth in those terms have already shown you everything you need to know about how much their measure means. Your name on a deed that you paid for, maintained, and kept right that is real. A forged signature is not. The truth doesn't need to be performed. It just needs to be documented. And it needs one person willing to say it clearly, once, without apology. If this story stayed with you, if any part of it felt familiar, don't forget to leave a comment below. I read all of them. And subscribe if you want to hear more stories about the moment someone finally decides that enough is enough. More are coming.